Hey everyone, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jay Kenner. I also write as Julie Kenner. I've published over 100 books, both traditionally and as an indie author. I used to be a lawyer, and I sold my first book in 1999. It came out in 2000, and I've been writing full-time since 2004. I'm known for having a pretty strong voice, and today we're going to talk about dialogue. So first off, what the heck is dialogue? So the Oxford English Dictionary has about a column and a half of definitions, but the most relevant one for our purposes are a conversation carried on between two or more persons, or to hold a dialogue or conversation. In addition, there's also that basic writer-speak definition, which is the words a character says, as in, whew, the dialogue in that movie was terrible, or that author gave the teenager some really unrealistic dialogue. Well, the easy answer to that question is that dialogue is the words between the quotation marks. And that's true, but there's so much more to it than that. Dialogue can also be contained in text messages because that's where people are communicating with each other. With internal dialogue, a character's communication with themselves. Monologues, a character's communication to the world. And yes, first-person narration. First person is probably one of my favorite ways to write, both first-person past, I said, and first-person present, I say, I go. In the context of dialogue, first-person narration is the character and the reader having a conversation. Granted, it's pretty one-sided. Your character is talking to the reader, or the author, me, as I'm writing the book. Not everyone thinks of that way, though. They think of dialogue solely as back-and-forth conversations, but really it's so much more than that. Take a look at this dialogue. This is the beginning of my book, Carpe Demon. My name is Kate Connor, and I used to be a demon hunter. I've often thought that would be a great pickup line at parties, but with a teenager, a toddler, and a husband, I'm hardly burning up the party circuit. She's talking to you. She's talking to the reader. She's introducing herself, just like if she met you at a party. But then, as you go on, you realize that there's more to it than that. Of course, the whole demon hunting thing is one great big gargantuan secret no one knows. Not my kids, not my husband, and certainly not folks at these imaginary parties. Guess what she's doing there? She's having a secret dialogue with you. You know it's dialogue, you know it's communication with you, the reader, because she's telling you something she hasn't even told her family. In other words, dialogue is anything that a character says to anyone. So let's drill down on that a little bit. What exactly is dialogue? Well, it's a tool. It's a tool for helping you tell your story in the best way possible. Just like you wouldn't use a bent nail or a headless hammer, you don't want to use the wrong dialogue. You don't want to use the wrong tool. So what is that? Well, flat dialogue, purposeless dialogue, clunky dialogue, unnecessary dialogue. You don't want to use any of that. You want your dialogue to do its job and hold its own. And we're going to talk about what exactly that means and how to do that. Dialogue does a lot of jobs in your story. It moves the action forward. It reveals character and sets up characterization. It provides exposition. It sets up, adds to, potentially resolves conflict. It entertains, and it helps with your structure in that it helps with story flow and presentation. Let's take a look at the idea of dialogue as action. You don't want dialogue to embellish the action. You want to understand that dialogue is the action. Dialogue gets a reaction. Therefore, it's moving the story forward. It acts in a cause and effect manner in your story. And the concept of show, don't tell still applies. Good dialogue isn't quote unquote telling. Good dialogue shows you what's going on. You want to answer the questions in the dialogue of why the character is speaking. What does the character want? And sometimes You can say something by saying nothing. You don't want well Timmy moments. You want the information to come across naturally in dialogue, not by someone saying, well, Timmy, the reason he's such a bad guy is X. Keep in mind that a character can say a lot of things, and it's all in the execution, how that dialogue works in your story. And I want to show you an example of saying something by saying nothing. So this is an edited scene from my best-selling book, Release Me. If you guys are familiar with my work, chances are you've read this story. And in this book, this is early on in the story, the narrator and heroine, Nikki Fairchild, is trying to meet a man she wants help from, Damien Stark. So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you, even though it probably sounds better in your head. I extend my hand. Nikki Fairchild, it's a pleasure. Miss Fairchild, he says, ignoring my hand. He looks from Carl to Evelyn, pointedly avoiding my eyes. You'll have to excuse me. There's something I need to attend to right away. And then he's gone, swallowed up into the crowd as effectively as a magician disappearing in a puff of smoke. All right. Damien essentially says nothing there. We know that he's a powerful guy. We know that she's come to the party to meet him. Her action is to get the conversation started. His reaction is to leave. That raises a story question. Why? Note that it also hits other things on our list too. We have conflict here that's going to move the story forward. You can bet she wants to know why. It also reveals character. Damien is the kind of guy who's willing to ignore societal conventions. I mean, he was pretty rude to her, right? So all of those things are packed into a very short snippet of dialogue. So let's talk a little bit more about character and characterization, the what you see stuff. Characterization, character is your character, and character is also how that person reacts, who they are deep at their core. Are they an honest person? Are they a manipulative person? Are they a sensual person? Who are they? That's character. Characterization is the stuff that you see and hear, the way that you would describe them. Characterization is not as deep as character, but it's important. So it's things like their accent, their looks, where they're from, that kind of thing. Character goes deeper. And character is revealed by how they act when they're between a rock and a hard place. Character is that deep core of a person. A really good friend of mine who wrote for Temptation back in the day, Kathleen O'Reilly, used to use a story about to describe character, about a woman, and she's got 5 kids, one of them in diapers, one of them barely walking. She takes them all to the grocery store. She's leaving to go back to her car on a hot day. She's just bought everything she needs for the birthday party, including like 5 pints of ice cream, and they're starting to melt, and she gets there and she realizes that the clerk gave her a $50 bill instead of a 5 in change. So what does she do? Does she figure that, well, the grocery store isn't going to go out of business and she's got kids and it's a hot day and she needs to get home before the ice cream melts? Or does she go back to the store to point that mistake out to the clerk? What if the clerk gave her a $5 bill instead of a $1 bill, so it's only a $4 difference? What her decision is tells you about her character. So that's where deep character is. If you've ever read Robert McKee's story, he goes into character so well, so I highly recommend that book. But here in this slide, we can talk about some of the way that dialogue can show characterization, that what you see stuff. Dialogue can reveal their education, your character's background and origin, their culture, where they're from, their profession. You look at things like their vocabulary, how they use grammar, whether they use a lot of sarcasm, what kind of throwaway words they use, whether or not their language is pretentious. Also their body language too, how they stand, how they move. For example, you would learn something about a character depending on whether he refers to a vehicle just as a car, or whether if he specifically points out that it's a Jaguar Type E or a Bugatti. Maybe he knows so much about cars that he's able to point out that something's a Baker Electric as opposed to just an old-timey car. Is it a jet or is it a Gulfstream Bombardier? Is it a cut or is it a laceration? You know what a doctor would say. Is it argument or is it a cross-examination? Don't cross-examine me, as opposed to don't argue with me, don't pick a fight with me. Don't cross-examine me is possibly someone who's a lawyer. Are they from the South? If they are, they probably say y'all or fixin' to. Do they call it soda or do they call it pop? All those kind of things can help reveal more and more about the character that you're writing. Also, grammar things. Me and Jenny went to the store versus Jenny and I went to the store. Things like that. And I gave you a few examples on the cards. One is from a horror story that I wrote a few years ago. Another is from a paranormal romance. In one, you get a bit of the southern cadence. You listen when I tell you something and you pay attention good. And the other is my secretary saw you walking down Broadway. And gee, isn't your condo on Broadway? And then the response is, objection, Your Honor, circumstantial evidence. Well, we're talking about a character there who happens to be a lawyer. If we didn't already know that, we could assume that that is the case. We've also got another example from Release Me. Sometimes bad is good. Bullshit, that's what people say to alleviate their own guilt or justify their weakness. Bad is bad. A is A. And then he responds, I didn't realize we were discussing philosophy. Shall I counter with the teachings of Aristoppus? Well, not many people pull out philosophers in the middle of arguments, especially when they're actually flirting. But we show here that Damien is very well educated and very well read. So how do you come up with these little details that give the characters flavor? You know, when I had a day job, it was actually easier because I was out in the world and it's easy to eavesdrop on people. And I came in contact with a lot of different people as an attorney from all, walks of life. From the very, very, very rich to people who were needing, assistance to have legal work done. Now it's a lot harder. I mostly come in contact with other writers. But you can pick this up, obviously, reading other fiction. Reading fiction, reading nonfiction, stepping out of your cave once in a while, even reality TV. Just keep your eyes and ears open for the way that people talk and think, and that will add a level of realism to your work. So, you remember what I said earlier about how dialogue ties in with character? Well, it does. Words, deeds, actions, all of those things play to someone's character. And words are actions too. Do they lie to protect someone? Are they a loose cannon? All of that comes from the character and not the writer. So you need to make sure that the dialogue that you give to the players in your book match the character that that person has. What's their core being? So character, again, one of the best ways to really get into this is to listen to Robert McKee has a series of videos and a really great book called Story. I highly recommend it. It's a great workshop and you can learn a lot. And one of the things that he is always saying is that, and a lot of people say this, is character is how a person acts under pressure. So you remember my example of the mom. We know she's honest if she goes all the way back despite her kids and the melting ice cream. But we want to show that. We don't want to just, tell the reader that Jane did that. We want to see her schlepping in the heat, dealing with the kids. The kids are whining, they're hot, and yet she's slogging back, and we see all of that, and we learn so much about her. We're going to be talking in this workshop about showing it in dialogue. So with this card that we're looking at, I'm sure most of you guys have seen The Empire Strikes Back. If you haven't, go watch this awesome movie. It's great. Han and Leia says, I love you, and Han says, I know. So what does Han's response tell you about his character? Well, it tells you that he's self-confident. He's not the kind of guy who's going to come right out and say how he feels. And if you didn't know that about him when you were writing him, you might have just written him to say, I love you too. But that wouldn't be Han. So you have to really know your characters in order to know what their dialogue is going to be. And the scene we had earlier from Release Me, where Damien just excused himself and walks away, that reveals the type of guy that he is. All of that comes from character. So the bigger question then is, how do you get to know your characters? Well, you can do character worksheets. Those don't work for a lot of people, myself included. I don't get anything from those, the pre-formatted ones that oftentimes want to know what type of soda they like and if they eat ice cream. Honestly, I don't really care what kind of ice cream my character wants to eat unless it's relevant to the moment. For some people they work. If they work for you, great. For me, they bore me to tears and do me no good whatsoever. But for me, characters are revelations. The only way to reveal them, to have those revelations, is to let those characters speak for themselves, much like you get to know a friend. They do that when I start to write them. So for me and for a lot of other authors, we start with the basic idea of the character that we've gotten to know in our imagination as we start to plan the story and plot the story. But then we develop them when we start to put them into action and see what they do or say. It's a little bit like method acting. I know the characters by stepping into their skin. Now, creating and developing characters is the subject of an entirely different workshop than dialogue, which reflects character. And certainly I will do those at a future date. But in the meantime, just know that you will figure out your own process for revealing characters, whether it's through worksheets, whether it's through kind of this method acting approach, whether it's through writing scenes and rewriting them until the character reveals itself. There are so many ways to get into character. And as a writer, everyone is a bit different, and you will find out your way. But in the meantime, we're going to move on with dialogue, and in addition to revealing character, it also delivers exposition. So it's going to tell us little things. It can tell us bits about the relationship that the character has with other people. It can tell us information about the character's world, about their backstory. It can reveal technical information in a story. It can reveal the stakes. There are rules, though, for when you are using dialogue to provide exposition in your story. It needs to be invisible. You don't info dump by doing a "well, Timmy" moment. "Well, Timmy, let me explain to you why Dr. Jones is an evil monster, because 20 years ago he blah, 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 blah." Nobody cares. We want to hear it in natural sounding dialogue. Don't info dump. Ideally, your dialogue should add some conflict. Again, that example I gave you from Release Me, we're setting up conflict between those characters. He's rude, she doesn't know why. Add some action. Dialogue can also just be entertaining. I mean, if you think of any movie that Joe Pesci is in, you're going to see a lot of entertaining dialogue that also serves other purposes, but it's entertaining. And again, that's another point. Your dialogue ideally should serve multiple purposes. If you do need to provide information in order to give the reader backstory or whatever, you want to do it cleverly. If you have never watched Jurassic Park, I highly recommend you do it, not only because it's a super fun movie, but because the way that they use the little DNA film strip to explain essentially the whole core science that supports this entire movie is absolutely brilliant. The Outlander books are wonderful examples of weaving the history that you need to know into the story. And that works just so wonderfully. And it's a great example of weaving in historical facts into the story narrative. I did tons of research on, nanotechnology and using, what the government has the ability to use to create tracking devices, and what scientifically would be legitimate, and what could be cutting edge, and what could my hero's company have invented that, works in the realm of like spy tech. And the slide that you see that says technical stuff is basically all of those hours of research on the kind of websites that probably mean I have an FBI file somewhere. That is one character looking at him and her expression making it clear that it sounds like he's talking about science fiction when he talks about crystalline quantum dots. And that's all we need for the story that this was. But it was pages and pages and pages boiled down to that little bit of character realization and character reaction to what Damien is saying, but we don't need to see it on the page because it's not actually that relevant to the story I was writing. You don't have to put in every freaking little detail, but you still need to do your research and then distill it into the context of a conversational back and forth. So we are at about the 20-minute mark here, a little bit beyond actually, and so I'm going to wrap up this first part of this dialogue workshop and come back next week with part 2. I'm not sure how many parts this is going to break into, 2 or 3, I think. I want to keep it in bite-sized pieces because there is a lot of information to parse. If you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, or you can email me through my website. The email is jkennerinfo@gmail.com, and I will be happy to address them in the next video or respond to your email. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope you join next week for part 2.